She pressed her mother's hand flat against her own chest so Ruth could feel her heartbeat steady, certain, and said, "I'm going. Don't argue with me." Ruth tried to sit up. The fever knocked her back against the pillow like a hand pushing her down. "Mabel, you can't ride to Red Willow alone. You don't know that man. You don't know what he'll—" "Mom." Mabel picked up the envelope from the nightstand. "If we lose this job, we lose the house. You know that." Ruth's eyes filled. She knew. Mabel kissed her forehead, tasted the salt of fever sweat, and walked out the door before either of them could say anything else that would make leaving harder. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss a single chapter of what happens next. Drop your city in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. We want to know how far Mabel's story has traveled. Now stay with us, because what that millionaire cattleman does when he sees her ride through his gates is something nobody at Red Willow Ranch saw coming. Not even him. The mare's name was Bess, and she was 15 years old, and she had not been asked to cover 11 miles in summer heat in a very long time. Mabel asked her anyway. She kept the pace steady, not punishing, but not gentle either, because the sun was already high, and the visiting ranchers Gideon Mercer was expecting for dinner weren't going to wait for anybody, and neither was the rent notice sitting behind the flour tin on the kitchen shelf at home. She'd been staring at that notice for 11 days. $32 overdue. Another 19 due at month's end. The arithmetic of it ran through her head the way a song runs through your head when you don't want it. Automatic, relentless, impossible to silence. She shifted her weight in the saddle and let Bess pick her footing on the rougher stretch past the creek crossing, and she made herself stop doing the arithmetic and start doing something more useful, which was thinking about what she was actually going to say when she got there. She'd rehearsed it during the night sitting up in the chair beside her mother's bed, while Ruth's breathing ran shallow and fast with the fever. She'd gone through 20 different versions of it. Firm, but not aggressive. Competent, but not arrogant. She needed Gideon Mercer to understand that this was not a charity call. She was not arriving at his door with her hat in her hand asking for sympathy. She was arriving with 10 years of work behind her and a dead man's empty chair that she'd been filling since she was 13 years old. She had earned the right to be heard. She just needed him to open the door long enough to figure that out. Red Willow Ranch appeared over the last rise at 10:30 in the morning, and Mabel pulled Bess to a walk and looked at it for a moment without letting herself feel anything about it. It was enormous. She'd known it was large. Everyone in Dry Creek knew Red Willow was one of the biggest operations in Wyoming territory, but knowing a thing and seeing it from a rise with the summer heat shimmering off the corrals and the main house sitting square and solid in the middle of it all were two different experiences entirely. The house was 2 stories. Real lumber, real glass in the windows, a proper porch running the full width of the front. 3 barns she could count from here. A smokehouse. A bunkhouse long enough to sleep 30 men. Corrals stretching east until the fence posts got too small to see. And somewhere inside all of it, a man who didn't know she existed was about to have a conversation he hadn't planned for. Mabel straightened her spine, touched her heels to Bess's sides, and rode down. She tied the mare at the hitching post near the cookhouse and walked toward the main house without slowing her step, because slowing down was the same as showing doubt, and she could not afford doubt right now. 2 ranch hands near the corral saw her first. She was aware of them, the way you're aware of weather, peripherally, constantly, with the particular alertness of a woman who has navigated male scrutiny her whole life. She heard one of them say something low to the other. She heard the other one laugh. She kept walking. The taller one stepped into her path. Young, maybe 19, with a gap between his front teeth and a hat pushed back on his head, at an angle that was meant to communicate ease and communicated instead that he had a great deal of time on his hands. "You lost, miss?" "No," Mabel said. "I'm here to see Mr. Mercer." The gap-toothed hand looked at his partner. The partner looked back with a grin he wasn't bothering to contain. "Mr. Mercer," the tall one repeated, slow and deliberate, the way people repeat something when what they actually mean is "that's funny." "That's so. That's so. You got an appointment?" "I have a letter." He held out his hand. Mabel looked at it. "It's addressed to Mr. Mercer," she said. "I'll give it to him." The smile dropped a notch. She'd surprised him. She could see at that brief recalibration men did when a woman declined to cooperate with the script they'd already written for her. He stepped aside with a small theatrical sweep of his arm. Mocking. She walked past him without acknowledging it. She knocked twice on the front door. Nothing. She could hear voices inside, low and businesslike, but nobody came. She knocked again. Harder. The door opened. A man in his mid-40s with a thick red mustache and a jacket that had never been near outdoor work looked at her with the expression of someone who'd opened the door expecting a package and found an inconvenience instead. "Can I help you?" he said. Flat, unwelcoming. "I need to speak with Mr. Mercer." "Mr. Mercer is occupied." "I'll wait." He looked at her, the way Warren Pike, she would learn his name later, looked at everything he considered beneath his employer's notice. Slowly, deliberately, starting at her face and moving down to the patched shoulder seam of her dress, the dust on her hem, the worn heel of her left boot, the plainness of her, and the roundness of her, and the fact that she had clearly arrived here directly from a life that had never had occasion to impress anyone. "Who are you?" he said. "Mabel Hartley. My mother is Ruth Hartley. She was hired to manage Mr. Mercer's kitchen and household stores. She's taken ill. I've come in her place." Pike stared at her. Then he laughed. Not a big laugh. Not an entertained laugh. The kind of laugh that comes out involuntarily when something strikes you as too absurd to pretend otherwise. "Mr. Mercer hired your mother," he said. "He did not hire you. Which is why I'd like to speak with him directly. Miss Hartley." He arranged his face into patience. The particular patience of men who've decided the person in front of them isn't worth genuine engagement. "Mr. Mercer doesn't receive walk-in visitors. If your mother is unable to fulfill her commitment, she's welcome to write explaining her situation. Good day." He started to close the door. Mabel put her palm flat against the frame, not pushing, one hand steady against the wood. But she did not move it. Pike stopped. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. She watched him process what was happening, that this woman had put her hand on his employer's door and was not removing it, and she watched him decide she was either very foolish or something he hadn't accounted for yet. "Tell Mr. Mercer that Ruth Hartley's daughter rode 11 miles in this heat to speak with him," Mabel said. "Tell him I'm not leaving until he hears what I have to say. If he decides not to come out after that, I'll go." No argument. But I want him to make that decision himself." 3 seconds of silence. Behind her, she was aware that the 2 ranch hands had drifted closer. 2 more had appeared at the barn door. She could feel their attention on her back, the particular weight of people watching something they expect to end badly and want to see when it does. She kept her hand on the frame. Pike held her gaze 1 more second. Then he turned and disappeared into the house. Mabel waited. She breathed through her nose. She kept her hands from shaking by making a conscious decision to keep them from shaking, which was the only technique she'd ever found that actually worked. She'd learned it in merchants' shops when she was 14, asking for credit extensions on her mother's behalf. She'd learned it in conversations with landlords who calculated looking at 2 women alone exactly what they could get away with. She'd learned it early, and she'd learned it well. The door opened. Gideon Mercer was not what she'd expected. She couldn't have said clearly what she had expected. The stories that circulated through Dry Creek about him had built something in her imagination, something sharper, more angular, a man whittled down to pure function by years of hard decisions. What she got was someone who looked like he'd been interrupted in the middle of working and hadn't stopped to change clothes for it. Collarless shirt, riding trousers with real use on them, boots that had covered genuine ground. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and deeply tanned dark hair, threaded with the first silver at his temples, and his face was the kind of face that didn't announce itself, that you had to look at twice to notice was remarkable. He looked at her. Not the way Pike had looked at her. Not cataloging. Not dismissing. The way a man looks at a fence line and immediately starts calculating what kind of work it's going to need. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She held out the envelope. "My mother asked me to give you this." He took it. He didn't open it immediately. "Warren tells me you put your hand on my door." "I did." "That takes something." "I didn't ride 11 miles to get turned away at the porch," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, but the first indication that a smile was a thing he was capable of. He broke the envelope's seal and read the letter without rushing. When he finished, he folded it once. "Your mother writes well," he said. "She taught school before my father died." "How sick is she?" The question hit somewhere she hadn't prepared for. Straight and plain, no softening around the edges. She answered the same way. "Fever, 3 days. The doctor says rest and water and time, but he can't promise how much time." Gideon was quiet. "Come inside," he said. Pike was standing near the window in the office with his arms crossed and his face sealed shut. He didn't speak. Mabel didn't look at him long enough to invite a conversation. There was a wooden chair near the wall, and she pulled it forward and sat before Gideon could fail to offer it, because standing across from him like a schoolgirl waiting to be excused was not a posture she intended to hold today. Gideon noticed. That almost smile again, brief and controlled. "You're not your mother," he said. "No. She's who I hired." "Yes, and she'll do the work you hired her for. When she's well enough to ride out here, she will. I'm asking you to hold that position by letting me fill it until she can." "I don't know you." "No," Mabel said. "So judge me the way you'd judge any new hire, by the work." He leaned back. "And if she doesn't recover?" Not a cruel question, a necessary one. She understood the difference. "Then I'll tell you honestly, and I'll thank you for the time, and I'll go." He tapped the letter once against his palm. He looked at her steadily, the kind of look that is actually paying attention rather than performing it. "Have you eaten today?" She hadn't expected that. Of all the things she'd braced for, that one came from nowhere. "I'll be fine," she said. "That wasn't what I asked." A beat. "No." "Come on then." He walked out of the office, and she followed him through the hall toward the back of the house where the kitchen sat wide and warm, and in the condition of something recently abandoned by whoever had been responsible for it. Pots on the stove with no particular plan. A bowl of cornmeal sitting on the table contributing nothing. A beef joint on the cutting board that had been purchased and then apparently ignored. A girl of about 17 standing near the stove with flour on her apron and the expression of someone holding a position they were not equipped to hold. "This is Nell," Gideon said. "Our cook walked off yesterday. She's been trying to put dinner together since this morning." He looked at Mabel. 22 hands tonight. 2 neighboring ranchers and their foreman. Contract discussion." Mabel looked at the beef joint. She looked at the shelves. She went to the shelves. She read them the way she read everything necessary. Fast, complete, nothing wasted. She opened jars, checked seals, pressed her thumb into the potato bin, lifted the corner of the flour sack, pulled the cold pantry door, and counted what was inside. Dried beans, a full sack. Onions good. Preserved tomatoes, 8 jars. Salt pork in aging brine. Lard. Baking flour. Wilted parsley still usable. A crate of apples going soft at the shoulders, not gone, just neglected. She turned around. "May I?" Gideon gestured. "Go ahead." She tied the apron, washed her hands, put Nell to work. Soaking the beans, moved the beef joint into a pot with onions and salt water. She started the stove. She didn't ask permission for any of it. She worked. Gideon pulled a stool to the kitchen table and sat with a ledger he'd brought from the office. He opened it and picked up his pen, and he worked while she worked, and the kitchen got warm, and nobody said anything for a while. Then he said, without looking up, "What's wrong with my pantry?" She glanced at him. "Beg pardon?" "You spent 2 minutes on those shelves, and I counted 6 different expressions. So," he looked up, "what's wrong with it?" Mabel set down her spoon. "The tomatoes are losing their seal. They've been stored somewhere with temperature swings, and the lids are compromised. 3 of those 8 jars will be bad by next week." She moved to the flour sack. "This was opened and left loose. In Wyoming summer, that's an invitation. You'll have pests in it inside a fortnight." She pointed at the potato bin. "Those are stored too close to the onions. They're shortening each other's life." Gideon's pen had stopped moving. "The beef joint," she continued. "That's an expensive single cut. 3 smaller cuts from different parts of the steer would have fed the same crew for 1/3 less money. And your salt pork brine is old that should have been restocked 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. Silence. "How do you know all that?" he said. "We couldn't afford to waste anything," Mabel said. "When every penny counts for the week's food, you learn fast what kills it early. You've been running your household since I was 13. My father died when I was 12. He held her gaze. "That's 10 years of this." "Yes." He looked back at the ledger. He didn't write anything for a long moment, just sat with the pen in his hand, and the scratch of it absent, and the only sounds were the stove and the slow bubble of the beans starting to move. "Then, what would you do with those apples?" "Bake them," Mabel said immediately. "Sugar cinnamon, I saw some behind the lard tin. Serve them after the beans and beef. The visiting ranchers get a proper dessert, and you've saved what most people would have thrown to the pigs." He looked at the apple crate. He looked at her. "All right," he said. She turned back to the stove. At 6 o'clock, 26 people sat down to slow braised beef in onion broth beans, seasoned with salt pork and preserved tomato, fresh cornbread and baked apples, sweetened with the cinnamon she'd found behind the lard tin. The visiting ranchers ate without talking, which was the highest compliment a working meal could receive. One of them, a gray-bearded man named Colbert, looked down the table and said to Gideon, "Where'd she come from?" "Dry Creek," Gideon said. "You keeping her?" A pause, short but there. "Working on it," Gideon said. After dinner, the hands filtered out, and the ranchers moved to the front room for their contract talk. Mabel and Nell cleaned the kitchen. When it was done, Mabel took off the apron, folded it over the chair back, and walked out to the porch because she needed air and a moment to think about what came next. She heard the screen door behind her. Gideon came and stood at the railing. He didn't look at the sky. He looked at her. "You need to get back to your mother," he said. "Yes. I'll have a hand ride with you. Road gets dark past the 3rd mile." "I don't need—" "I know you don't," he said. "I'm offering it anyway." She pressed her lips together. "Thank you." He reached into his jacket and held out an envelope. She looked at it without taking it. "What's that?" "Week's pay, same as agreed with your mother." "I haven't agreed to work a week." "I have," he said. "Come back tomorrow morning, and every morning after until Ruth Hartley is well enough to make this ride herself." She looked at the envelope. She thought about the rent notice, the mare's shoes, the medicine. She did not reach for it yet. "I need to be clear about what this is," she said. "Go ahead. This is work. I'm paid for what I do, not helped, not taken in, not given anything out of sympathy." She looked straight at him. "The day you think you're doing me a kindness, instead of paying me for what I've earned, I want you to tell me, and I'll go." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "That's the plainest employment condition anyone's ever put to me," he said. "Is it acceptable?" "It is." She took the envelope. She was on the second porch step when he spoke again. "Miss Hartley." She turned. "Your mother's letter says she raised you alone for 10 years. His voice was even. "She didn't give herself enough credit." Mabel stood with the envelope against her side and the Wyoming night coming in around the edges of everything, and she let that sentence land where it needed to land, which was somewhere she hadn't thought to guard. "I'll tell her you said so," she said. She rode home with a ranch hand at a respectful distance behind her. The sky above was enormous and dark and full of stars that didn't care about any of it. Bess moved steady beneath her. The envelope was tucked inside her dress where the letter had been that morning. When she got home, Ruth was awake. Barely. Eyes clearer than they'd been at dawn. The lamp on the nightstand turned low. Mabel sat on the edge of the bed. She put the envelope on the quilt between them. Ruth looked at it, looked at her daughter. "What did you do?" "I went to Red Willow," Mabel said. "I cooked dinner for 26 people. I told the richest man in Wyoming what was wrong with his pantry." She met her mother's eyes. "And I got you your job back." Ruth's hand found hers. "Mabel, don't." Mabel's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Don't say thank you. Just get better. I have to be back there by sunrise." Ruth closed her eyes. Mabel sat with her until the breathing deepened and slowed into real sleep. And then she kept sitting there because she wasn't ready to stop yet. She thought about Warren Pike's laugh at the door. She thought about the two ranch hands and their private joke, and the theatrical sweep of an arm designed to make her feel small. She thought about Gideon Mercer pulling a stool to the kitchen table and opening his ledger and working alongside her without comment, as though the arrangement was already settled, and he was simply waiting for her to catch up to that fact. She thought about, "The day you think you're doing me a kindness instead of paying me for what I've earned, I want you to tell me." And she thought about the way he'd said it, "is not of course, or certainly, or any of the reassuring words men used when they were managing a situation. Just, it is. Plain and final. Like a door closing on every version of this conversation that might have gone differently. She reached over and turned the lamp down until the flame went out. The dark settled. The rent notice was still behind the flour tin. The mare still needed new shoes. Her mother still had fever to fight through. Nothing had been solved tonight except one thing, and that one thing was that tomorrow morning had somewhere to be. It was, she decided, enough. She'd ridden out this morning with a dead man's letter and a horse too old for the job, and nothing but the stubbornness her mother had spent 10 years building into her bone by bone. And she'd come home with a week. Next week she'd come home with something more. She didn't know yet what Gideon Mercer was going to cost her. She didn't know yet what Warren Pike was already planning. She didn't know that Red Willow Ranch, this enormous, indifferent, well-run machine of a place, was about to need her in ways that had nothing to do with cooking. She only knew one thing with any certainty, sitting there in the dark, with her mother's quiet breathing, and the envelope on the quilt, and the first pale suggestion of tomorrow, beginning somewhere at the edge of the sky. She was going back, and this time she was walking through that door like she belonged there, because she did. She was back at Red Willow before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Bess moved slower than yesterday. The old mare had earned that, but Mabel pushed her through the last mile at a steady clip because she'd told Gideon Mercer she'd be there by sunrise, and she intended to be a woman whose word meant something from the very first day. The ranch was already awake when she rode in. Smoke from the cookhouse, voices from the bunkhouse. Two hands crossing the yard with their heads down and their collars up against the early morning chill that came off the Wyoming hills before the heat took over. Nobody laughed this time. She didn't know if that was because they'd heard about dinner last night, or because she simply looked different, arriving with a purpose than she had arriving with a question. Either way, she tied Bess at the post, smoothed her dress, and walked straight to the cookhouse door. Nell was already inside, struggling with the breakfast fire. "The damper's stuck," Nell said by way of greeting, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone who'd been fighting the same problem for 20 minutes alone. Mabel crossed the room, crouched in front of the stove, and worked the damper free with two firm twists of her wrist. The drawer opened. The fire caught. Nell stared at her. "How'd you do that?" "Same stove we have at home," Mabel said. "The left hinge warps in cold weather. You have to push in before you pull." She stood, tied her apron, and started breakfast. She made enough for 25 thick-cut cornmeal mush with salt pork biscuits from the flour she'd resealed properly the night before, and coffee strong enough to mean something. By the time the hands came through the cookhouse door, everything was ready and hot and on the table. She watched them eat. She was looking for something specific, not compliments. She didn't need those. She was looking at what they left on their plates, what they reached for first, what they pushed aside. You learned more about a kitchen's problems from what people didn't eat than from what they did. What she saw was this: the men ate fast and without pleasure. Not because the food was bad, because they'd been conditioned to eat fast and without pleasure. The cookhouse had never been a place where a man felt like he was being fed. It had been a place where a man's hunger got handled, and that was all. She filed that away. Warren Pike appeared in the cookhouse doorway at 7:30, surveyed the room with the expression of a man conducting an inspection he expects to find disappointing, and fixed his gaze on Mabel. "Mr. Mercer wants the inventory ledger reviewed this morning," he said. "The kitchen accounts." "I'll be ready at 9, Mabel said. "He wants it now. Breakfast isn't cleared yet." She looked at him steadily. "The ledger will still say the same thing at 9 that it says right now. I'll be there at 9. Pike's jaw tightened. He left. Nell, who was stacking plates at the far end of the table, glanced at Mabel with wide eyes. "He's not a man people say no to," she said quietly. "He's not the man who hired me," Mabel said. Hand me that stack. At 9 o'clock exactly. She walked into Gideon's office with the kitchen ledger under her arm and 3 separate notes she'd written out that morning on the back of a flour sack paper, because she hadn't had proper writing paper and she'd needed somewhere to put what she'd found. Gideon was at his desk. He looked up when she came in. "You're precise," he said. 9 o'clock means 9 o'clock, she said. She sat in the same chair she'd pulled forward yesterday. She put the ledger on the desk between them and opened it to the first page she'd marked with a folded corner. "This ledger hasn't been accurately maintained in at least 4 months, she said. "The entries are there, but they don't match what's actually in the pantry. You're paying for quantities that aren't arriving." Gideon went still. "Show me," he said. She showed him. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, the temperature in the room had changed the way temperature changes when someone finally says out loud, a thing that's been wrong for a long time, and everyone was hoping would fix itself. "The discrepancy on the beef account alone is $17 for this month," Mabel said. "Last month it was 14. The month before 11. It's growing." Gideon had his elbows on the desk and his hands pressed together in front of his mouth. He was looking at the numbers, and his expression was the kind of expression that isn't about the numbers. It's about what the numbers mean about a person you trusted. "Warren manages these accounts," he said. "I know," Mabel said. A silence. "Are you telling me Warren is stealing from me?" "I'm telling you the ledger doesn't match the pantry," Mabel said carefully. "What that means is something you'll need to investigate further. I'm not in a position to accuse anyone. I'm in a position to tell you what I can see." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "Most people," he said slowly, "would have kept that observation to themselves. Most people don't have my mother's rent depending on this ranch staying solvent," Mabel said. He almost smiled. Then he stood, took the ledger, and walked to the door. "Stay here," he said. She waited. She heard his footsteps cross the hall, heard a door open, heard voices, first low, then sharper. She couldn't make out words, but she could make out the shape of the conversation. Gideon asking. Pike answering. Gideon asking again differently. Pike's voice climbing a register. Then quiet. Gideon came back into the office and closed the door. "He says the supplier shortchanged the delivery," he said. "Then there should be a complaint filed with the supplier," Mabel said. "And a notation in the ledger. There's neither." Gideon looked at the ledger in his hand. He set it on the desk. "You've been here one morning," he said. "Yes." "And you found this in one morning." "The numbers aren't hidden," Mabel said. "They're just not being compared to anything. As long as no one checks the pantry against the ledger looks fine." He stood at the desk with his hand flat on the open ledger page, and his jaw set in a particular way that told her he was deciding something not about the numbers, she thought. About her. About what kind of woman came to his ranch asking for her mother's job and found something like this on her second morning and brought it to him directly instead of watching it quietly from a safe distance. "What would you do," he said finally, "if you were me?" She hadn't expected to be asked. She took a breath. "I'd ask the supplier directly, not through Pike, directly for copies of every delivery record going back 6 months. I'd compare them against your ledger entries line by line. And I'd do it without telling anyone I was doing it until I had the full picture." Gideon nodded once. "Right," he said. "Get back to your kitchen." She got up and went. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Mabel fell into faster than she'd expected. Mornings were breakfast and the first round of kitchen organization. She was systematically working through every shelf, every barrel, every crate in the pantry and cookhouse, not all at once, because the work had to keep running while she reorganized it, but shelf by shelf, day by day. The way you repair a fence while the cattle are still using the pasture. She found things. Not all of them were as serious as the ledger discrepancies, but all of them were costing Gideon money. He didn't know he was losing. Spoiled preserves that should have been caught 2 weeks earlier. A sugar purchase at a merchant 3 towns over that was priced 40 cents higher per pound than the merchant in Dry Creek. Smoked meat hanging in a corner of the smokehouse that had gone past its usefulness and never been accounted for or replaced. She wrote it all down on flour sack paper because she still didn't have proper writing paper, and she'd developed a system that worked well enough. Neat columns, dates, figures, what was lost, and what it cost, and what the correction would save going forward. She brought it to Gideon every morning at 9. He read every page. He never told her to stop. On the fourth morning, he was waiting for her at the office door instead of inside at his desk, and he had his jacket on and his hat in his hand, and the look of a man who'd made up his mind about something. "Come with me," he said. She followed him to the barn where 2 horses were saddled. He handed her the reins of a bay mare that was considerably younger and better fed than Bess. "We're riding the east fence line," he said. "I want to show you the cattle operation, and I want you to tell me what you see from a provision standpoint. How many head, how much feed required, how that translates to what this kitchen needs to be putting up for winter." Mabel looked at the bay mare. She looked at him. "That's not a kitchen question." "No," he said. "It's a ranch question. But the kitchen is connected to the ranch, and you seem to understand systems better than anyone I've employed in the last 3 years, so." He put his hat on. "Can you ride?" "I rode 11 miles to get here," she said. "That's a yes then." They rode for 3 hours along the east fence line, while the Wyoming morning opened up into full summer heat. Gideon talked about the cattle operation with the particular directness of a man who knew his subject completely and didn't feel the need to perform his knowledge for anyone, just stated facts, asked questions, listened to answers. He asked her about winter provisioning for large numbers of working men. She told him what she knew from the reading she'd done. Her mother had a small library, mostly practical books, and Mabel had worked through most of them over the years, and what she'd worked out herself from managing their household. He listened the way he read completely without performing attention. She found it disconcerting at first being listened to that fully. She was accustomed to being heard selectively the way people listened to women in those days, taking the parts that confirmed what they'd already thought and leaving the rest. Gideon didn't do that. He asked a follow-up question that told her he'd heard exactly what she'd said, turned it over, found the edge he wanted to examine. "You said beef preserving is more efficient at the source than at the kitchen," he said. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning if you salt and smoke the beef at the point of slaughter instead of transporting it whole to the kitchen. First, you lose less to spoilage, and the finished product is better quality. You'd need to build a larger smokehouse or divide the existing one, but the savings over a winter season would more than cover the cost of the expansion." He rode without speaking for a minute. "My foreman said the same thing 2 years ago," he said. "Did you do it?" "No." "Why not?" He looked at her sideways. "Warren advised against the expense." Mabel said nothing. She didn't need to. They rode back to the ranch in the late morning with the sun directly overhead and the shadows straight down beneath the horses' feet. When they came through the gate, 3 ranch hands near the corral watched them ride in together and looked at each other with expressions Mabel registered without reacting to. She knew what that looked like. A woman riding the fence line with the boss. She knew what people would make of it. She also knew she had done nothing that required an apology, and she had no intention of behaving as though she had. She dismounted, handed the bay mare's reins to the hand, who came forward to take them, and walked directly to the cookhouse to start the midday meal. Warren Pike was waiting inside. I was standing near the shelving, not working, not doing anything with purpose, just standing there in the particular way of a man who has arranged himself to be encountered. When Mabel came through the door, he turned with the smooth, prepared quality of someone who'd been rehearsing. "A word, Miss Hartley," he said. "I have a meal to start," she said. She moved past him toward the stove. "This won't take long." His voice carried a careful pleasantness that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "I want you to understand something. I've managed Red Willow's accounts for 3 years. Mr. Mercer trusts my judgment in financial matters. What you found in that ledger was a supplier error, as I told him, and it's being corrected. It would be unfortunate if an inexperienced newcomer were to create unnecessary confusion by misreading figures she doesn't fully understand." Mabel picked up a pot, set it on the stove. "The figures I brought to Mr. Mercer were accurate," she said. "I'm sure you believe so. Believing and knowing are different things." She turned to look at him. "I know so." A beat. "You're a kitchen worker," Pike said, and the pleasantness had dropped about 3 degrees. "A temporary one. Your mother is the person Mr. Mercer hired, not you. It would serve you well to remember the limits of your position here. Thank you for the advice, Mabel said. She turned back to the stove. She heard him stand there for another moment. She could feel it, the particular quality of a man recalculating. And then she heard him walk out. She let out a slow breath she'd been holding without realizing it. Nell appeared from the back room with a basket of onions. She'd clearly heard every word, and her expression had the particular tension of someone very young who'd witnessed something they weren't sure how to process. He scares most people, Nell said. I know, Mabel said. He doesn't scare you. Mabel thought about this honestly before she answered because she believed in answering things honestly rather than impressively. He concerns me, she said. That's not the same thing. Nell considered that. Then she started peeling onions, and neither of them said anything more about Warren Pike, and the midday meal got made, and 23 men sat down to beef stew and fresh bread and ate like people who expected to be fed properly, which was already an improvement over 4 days ago. That evening, for the first time, one of the hands, a quiet older man named Dorsey, who ran the cattle count and had a gray beard, and the deliberate movements of someone who didn't waste effort, stopped at the cookhouse door on his way out and turned back. Miss Hartley, he said. She looked up. Best stew I've had at this ranch in 2 years, he said. He nodded once and walked on. Nell looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at the pot she was scrubbing. Don't make a thing of it, she said, but she was already fighting a smile that she had no particular interest in winning against. The following days moved forward with the accumulating weight of things going right, which was its own particular kind of exhaustion Mabel had learned, because going right required constant maintenance in a way that going wrong did not. She reorganized the cold pantry on Wednesday. She renegotiated the flour purchase with the Dry Creek merchant. On Thursday, she rode in herself early before the merchant had settled into his morning routine, and she put 3 competing price quotes on his counter that she'd written out from memory based on what she knew other ranches in the territory were paying, and she left with a rate 18 cents lower per 100 pounds. She told Gideon about it that evening at 9 o'clock in the way she'd begun telling him about the day's findings, briefly, factually, without embellishment. He looked at the number. He looked at her. You negotiated that yourself? Yes. Without consulting me. The flour purchase is a kitchen account, she said. I didn't think it required your approval. It doesn't, he said. I'm just noting that you did it. Did you want me not to? No, Gideon said. I want you to keep doing it. He leaned back. I want to know where else we're overpaying. And so the evening briefings became something more, less a report, and more a conversation. The two of them at his desk, with ledgers and flour sack notes spread between them, working through the ranch's provision costs with the systematic attention of 2 people who'd both discovered that this particular problem was more interesting than either had anticipated. She noticed things about him during those evenings. I didn't pretend to understand something when he didn't. If she used a term from the preserving trade that he wasn't familiar with, he said so directly and asked her to explain it, and then he remembered it, and the next time it came up, he used it correctly. Most men she'd encountered in positions of authority had a particular reflex of performing understanding when they lacked it, as though admitting a gap were a vulnerability they couldn't afford. Gideon didn't have that reflex. It struck her as one of the more genuinely impressive things about him precisely because he'd clearly never thought of it as impressive. It was just how he operated. She also noticed that he'd started arriving at the cookhouse in the mornings. Not interfering, not supervising. Just appearing with a cup of coffee before the hands came in, sitting at the end of the long table with his ledger working. As though the cookhouse had become quietly, and without announcement, the part of the ranch where he chose to start his day. The hands noticed too. She caught the glances quick-checking, recalibrating, the social mathematics of a working ranch, perpetually calculating who was where in relation to who and what it meant. On the 10th day, she received a letter from her mother. Ruth wrote in the careful schoolteacher's hand Mabel had known since childhood, and the letter said that the fever had broken fully on Sunday, that she was eating properly and regaining her strength, and that Mrs. Farrow had been an angel, and Mabel was not to worry. It also said, I hear you've reorganized Gideon Mercer's pantry and renegotiated his flour account and found discrepancies in his ledger. Dry Creek is a small town sweetheart. Everyone knows everything by Wednesday. I am not surprised. I am proud. Come home Sunday if you can. Mabel folded the letter. She put it inside her dress where she'd carried the job offer envelope on the first morning. She was still standing there when Gideon came in for his morning coffee. He took one look at her face. Good news or bad? My mother's fever broke, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said, and the word was simple and direct and carried exactly the right weight. Not theatrical relief, not performed gladness, just the clean recognition of something worth being glad about. She nodded and turned back to the stove, and they didn't say anything else about it, and it was somehow the most human she'd felt since arriving at Red Willow Ranch. The crisis arrived on the 14th day, without warning. The way crises always arrive right in the middle of something else. A supply wagon was due from the territorial depot, flour, salt, coffee, sugar-dried goods enough for the month's heavy work ahead. 40 hands would be on the ranch for the cattle gathering starting in 4 days. 3 neighboring ranchers were coming to finalize the contracts Gideon had been negotiating for weeks. The cookhouse needed to operate at double its normal capacity, which Mabel had spent 6 days planning for, and the wagon was the foundation of that plan. The wagon didn't come. She sent Nell to check at the gate at 3 o'clock, at 4, at 5, at 5:30 with dinner already behind schedule, and no supplies, and 40 people expecting to eat in 30 minutes. Mabel walked to Gideon's office and opened the door without knocking. He looked up. The supply wagon hasn't come, she said. The order was placed, the money was paid. I saw the ledger entry myself. It's not here. Gideon stood. I'll send a rider to the depot. That won't help tonight, Mabel said. I need to know right now what's in this ranch that I can work with. Not what should be here, what is actually here. He came with her. They went through this cookhouse, the cold pantry, the main pantry, and the secondary storage in the back of the barn, the barrel stores and the winter stock that hadn't been touched yet. Mabel moved fast, talking as she went. Gideon keeping up and answering her inventory questions with the directness of a man who knew his own property. Beans, how many sacks in the barn? 4, maybe 5. Get me a count. Cornmeal. 2 barrels. Flour. 1 sack after the kitchen supply. The rest was supposed to be on that wagon. She stopped, turned. Salt pork in the smokehouse. 30 pounds, maybe more. Smoked beef. Some. Dorsey would know the count. Get Dorsey. She was already moving back toward the cookhouse. And send someone to every house on this ranch and tell them I need every preserved vegetable, every jar, every crock of anything they have that's edible and aren't eating tonight. Tell them Mr. Mercer will replace it doubled when the wagon comes. Gideon stopped. You want me to ask the ranch families? I want you to ask people who work for you to help you through a hard night, she said. Most of them will be glad to do it. Ask. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he went. What happened next was something Mabel would not fully understand until she was older, the way a community reveals itself in a crisis, not in the big gestures, but in the small immediate ones, the ones that happen before anyone has time to calculate the cost. Dorsey's wife sent 6 jars of preserved corn. The line foreman's household sent dried apples and a crock of pickled cabbage. 2 of the older hands went to the river and came back in 40 minutes with enough catfish to feed 12 people. Nell appeared with a smoked ham from her family's house that her mother had pressed on her with the particular generosity of women who understood what an empty kitchen felt like. Warren Pike watched all of this from the doorway of the main house, with his arms crossed and his face carefully arranged into an expression that communicated nothing. Mabel cooked. She ran the cookhouse, the way her mother had taught her to run a hard week, not by thinking about the whole problem at once, which was paralyzing, but by thinking about the next task. Only. The next task, completing it, moving to the one after. Beans on to soak by 4 in the afternoon. Cornmeal mush starting at 5. Salt pork cut fine to go into everything and stretch it. The catfish seasoned and put on at 5:30. The pickled cabbage and preserved corn out at 6 with the bread she'd stretched the last of the flour into thinner loaves than she wanted, but enough. At 6:15 43 people sat down. The three visiting ranchers looked at the table and then at each other. One of them, not Colbert this time, a younger man named Hatch with sharp eyes and the direct manner of someone used to assessing situations, quickly said to Gideon, "Heard your supply wagon didn't make it." "That's right," Gideon said. Hatch looked at the table again. Full, hot, organized. "Your kitchen manager know that." Gideon looked down the table to where Mabel was directing Nell and two hands she'd conscripted as servers. "She figured it out," he said. When Mabel finally set down the last serving spoon and took a breath, it was nearly 8 o'clock. She was standing in the cookhouse with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her apron past saving, and the particular bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd held a situation together by force of will for 4 hours straight. Dorsey came to the cookhouse door. "Mr. Mercer wants you," he said. She went. Gideon was standing on the front porch. Behind him, through the window, she could see the visiting ranchers still at the table talking, which meant the business conversation was going well. She stood at the base of the porch steps and looked up at him. "The Hatch contract," he said. "He signed tonight." Mabel waited. He said in 20 years of doing business with Wyoming ranches, he'd never seen a house come through a supply failure without either turning guests away or putting something on the table he wouldn't feed his dogs. Gideon's voice was even. He said if Red Willow ran its cattle operation half as well as it ran its kitchen, he'd do business with us for the next decade. She didn't say anything. "I need to know," Gideon said, "what happened to that supply wagon." "I suspect you already know," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "The ledger entry." "It was there," she said. "The order was placed. The money was paid. The supplies didn't arrive." She held his gaze. "Someone redirected that wagon, Mr. Mercer, and whoever did it knew exactly what it would cost you tonight." The silence on that porch was the kind of silence that comes before something changes permanently. Gideon looked out at the dark ranch yard. His hands were on the railing, and his knuckles had gone pale with the pressure of them. "Warren's been with this ranch for 3 years," he said. It wasn't a defense. It was the sound of a man beginning to understand the full dimensions of something he'd been trusting without examining. "I know," Mabel said. "I'm sorry." He looked at her. "Don't be. You didn't do this." He straightened. "Go get some rest. I have some things to deal with." She was already down the steps when his voice stopped her. "Miss Hartley." She turned. "You didn't save my supper tonight." His voice was quiet and completely serious. "You saved a contract worth more money than your mother's annual wages times 10. I want you to know that I know that." Mabel stood in the dark below the porch with the stars coming hard overhead and the smell of wood smoke and cooked beans in her clothes, and the accumulated weight of 14 days pressing down on her in a way she hadn't let herself feel until this moment. "I just did my job," she said. "No," Gideon said. "You did a great deal more than that." She went to the cookhouse. She sat on the bench outside the door and let herself be tired, really, and completely tired, in the way she rarely permitted herself. She thought about Warren Pike standing in that doorway with his arms crossed, while people who actually worked for a living brought preserved corn and smoked ham and fresh catfish, and did it without being asked twice. She thought about the number Gideon had named the value of the Hatch contract. She thought about $32 overdue rent and $19 coming due, and the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head for 11 days straight. She thought about her mother's letter folded inside her dress. And she thought for the first time since she'd ridden out of Dry Creek on a 15-year-old horse with a dead man's letter pressed against her ribs that something was happening here that was larger than a job. She didn't know exactly what to do with that yet. She only knew that when she went back inside and looked at the cookhouse she'd reorganized shelf by shelf over 2 weeks. The sealed jars, the properly stored flour, the ledger columns that matched the pantry. For the first time in months, it looked like something she'd built. Not borrowed from. Built. And the woman who'd built it was no longer the same woman who'd knocked on Red Willow's door 14 mornings ago asking for a chance. She was something more than that now. She just hadn't decided yet what to call it. She was pouring the morning coffee when Gideon came through the cookhouse door with Warren Pike's ledger books under his arm and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but the thing that lives just beneath anger in a man who's spent years building something and just discovered someone's been taking pieces of it. He set the ledgers on the table. "I need you to look at these," he said. "All of them. Not just the kitchen accounts. Everything." Mabel set down the coffee pot. "That's 3 years of financial records." "I know what it is." She looked at the stack. Then she looked at him. "What did you find last night?" "Enough," he said. "I found enough. But I want the full picture before I do anything I can't undo." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Will you do it?" "Yes," she said. "Give me today." He nodded and stood. At the door he stopped. "Pike came to my office this morning before I was dressed," he said. "Wanted to talk about the supply wagon. Said he'd identified the shipping company's error and was handling a correction personally." Mabel was quiet. "He looked me in the eye," Gideon said. "Steady as anything. 3 years, and he looked me in the eye." He walked out. She worked through the ledgers, the way she worked through everything methodically, without skipping ahead to the conclusion, because the conclusion meant nothing without the foundation beneath it. She started at the beginning, 36 months back, and she moved forward month by month with a piece of charcoal and a stack of flour sack paper she'd cut into pages, writing columns as she went. Nell brought her lunch at noon. She ate without looking up. By 2 o'clock, she had the shape of it. By 4, she had the full picture. By 5, she sat back and looked at what she'd written and felt the particular cold clarity that comes from understanding something you wish you didn't understand. Warren Pike had been running 2 systems simultaneously for 3 years. The first was the ledger he showed Gideon, clean professional numbers that all pointed in the right direction. The second was what the numbers actually described if you compared them against the supplier invoices, the delivery records, and the pantry inventories that nobody had ever been asked to cross-reference, because Pike was the one who filed both sets of documents and the one who told Gideon there was no discrepancy worth examining. The beef account, the flour account, the hardware and fencing account, the wage advances for seasonal labor that had been recorded but not distributed, the supplier rebates that had come to Red Willow and been logged as operational expenses before they quietly disappeared. She added the columns 3 times to make sure. $487 over 3 years. In a territory where a good ranch hand earned $20 a month, that was nearly 2 years' wages for a full crew member taken in quiet pieces, small enough not to catch the eye until you put every piece on the same table and looked at them together. She gathered her pages, put them in order, and carried them to Gideon's office. Howe was at his desk. He looked at her face before she said a word, and whatever he saw there told him enough that he was already reaching for the papers as she laid them down. She let him read. He read for a long time without speaking. She sat in her chair and waited and watched his face move through things she didn't feel it was her place to name. When he finished, he set the pages down. $487, he said. Yes. 3 years. Yes. Howe was quiet. Then, I trusted him. I know. He's eaten at my table. He's been in this house when I was... He stopped, pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. He advised me against expanding the smokehouse, against renegotiating the flour account, against 6 things that would have reduced his opportunity to take from me. His voice had gone very flat. The flatness of a man controlling something he doesn't want to perform for anyone. Every piece of advice he gave me that cost me money, it cost me money on purpose. Mabel said nothing. There was nothing to say that the numbers hadn't already said more clearly. "Where is he now?" Gideon said. "I haven't seen him since this morning," she said. Gideon stood. He was already moving to the door when Mabel said, "Wait." He stopped. "Don't go at him tonight," she said. "Not like this, not alone." He turned. His expression had the particular controlled danger of a man who's been patient a long time and just found the edge of it. "He's stolen from this ranch for 3 years. I know that," Mabel said, "and he'll be held accountable for every dollar of it. But if you go at him tonight without documentation filed, without a witness, without the ledgers secured, he'll say the records are wrong. He'll say I misread them. He'll say a temporary kitchen worker with no formal training made errors in her calculations. And the real problem is why Mr. Mercer trusted a widow's daughter with his financial records in the first place. The silence was sharp. Gideon stood in the doorway and looked at her. "He'll use me against you," she said quietly. "Don't give him the chance." A long moment. "What do you recommend?" he said. And the fact that he asked her, that he stood in that doorway, and asked her, this man who'd built a cattle empire through his own judgment and wasn't accustomed to seeking counsel on his own property, told her something she filed away carefully because it mattered and she didn't want to mishandle it. "Lock the office tonight," she said. "Take the ledgers. In the morning, send your foreman to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. Send a rider to the supplier directly, not through Pike directly, and ask for their copies of every delivery record going back 3 years. When the marshal arrives, you'll have documentation that speaks for itself. He won't be able to say a word against it." Gideon looked at her steadily. "That could take 3 days." "Yes. Pike could run." "He could," she said. "But I don't think he will. He doesn't think we have enough to act on. He came to your office this morning and looked you in the eye because he's confident. He thinks I found a small ledger error that he can explain away. He doesn't know what we spent today on." Another silence. Then Gideon walked back to the desk, picked up the ledgers, picked up her pages of figures, and put them all under his arm. "Lock your cookhouse tonight," he said. "I always do," she said. He looked at her from the doorway, with an expression she couldn't fully read, something in it that was more than the situation required, that had moved past the accounting and the strategy and arrived somewhere she didn't have a name for yet. "Thank you, Miss Hartley," he said. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He almost smiled. Then he was gone. She sat alone in the office for a moment after he left. The lamp was burning low. Outside she could hear the ranch settling into its evening sounds, horses shifting in the barn, distant voices from the bunkhouse, a door somewhere closing. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place that didn't know yet what was moving beneath its surface. She picked up the piece of charcoal she'd been working with all day. Her fingers were black with it, the numbers still visible in the creases of her knuckles. $487. She thought about what that number would have meant to her and her mother over the past 10 years. The winters it would have heated. The debts it would have retired. The years of sewing and lawn work and careful arithmetic it represented in their lives, not stolen, earned one careful dollar at a time. She set the charcoal down. She went to lock the cookhouse. The next morning moved with the deceptive normalcy of a day that knows something is coming and hasn't announced it yet. Breakfast went up at 6. The hands ate. The cattle gathering was 2 days out, and the ranch had the focused, forward-leaning energy of a place preparing for serious work. Mabel ran the cookhouse at double capacity and managed the provisioning plan she'd spent a week building, preserves staged for transport. Smoked meat, inventoried the grain stores, counted and recounted. Warren Pike appeared at breakfast for the first time in 3 days. He sat at the end of the table with the visiting foreman and ate with the composed ease of a man with a clear conscience, and he looked at Mabel exactly twice, once when he came in, and once when he left, with an expression both times that was calm and slightly amused, the expression of a man who considers himself the only adult in the room. She kept her face neutral and kept moving. At 9 o'clock she went to Gideon's office. He was already there with Dorsey, his foreman, who had the look of a man who'd been briefed and was processing the information with the slow, solid gravity of someone who didn't rush to conclusions, but didn't back away from them either. "Ryder went to Cheyenne at dawn," Gideon said when she came in. "Supplier's copy of the records is being fetched from the depot by another man. Should have both by tomorrow morning." Mabel nodded. "Pike at breakfast this morning." "I know. Dorsey saw him. Dorsey said, he asked me how the cattle count was coming, normal as Sunday." "He's not nervous," Mabel said. "No," Gideon said. "He's not. That means he has something else," she said. Both men looked at her. If he were simply confident in his story, he'd be avoiding attention. The fact that he's sitting down to breakfast and asking about the cattle count means he's either planning to leave before the marshal arrives, or he has a move we haven't anticipated. Gideon looked at Dorsey. Something passed between them, the shorthand of men who've worked together long enough to communicate in partial sentences. "Keep eyes on him," Gideon said, quietly. Dorsey left. Gideon looked at Mabel. "What kind of move?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But he's been managing your accounts for 3 years. He knows where the financial vulnerabilities are. He's already deflected once by blaming the supplier. If he has a second deflection ready—" She stopped. "What?" "I'd want to make sure the ledgers are somewhere he can't access them before tonight," she said. Gideon's jaw set. "I locked the office. Does he have a key?" A pause. Gideon stood and walked out of the office without a word. She followed him down the hall to the locked office door. He checked the lock. He looked at the frame around it. Then he crouched and looked at the floor in front of the door. There were faint marks in the wood. Recent. The kind left by something thin worked into a doorframe. Gideon stood up. His face had gone very still. "He came in last night," he said. "The ledgers," Mabel said. They went inside. The ledgers were still there. She could see the stack where Gideon had left them. But the order was wrong. Not obviously wrong. One ledger shifted half an inch the corner of another, not quite aligned. The kind of wrong that most people wouldn't notice. Mabel noticed. "He's been in here," she said. "He didn't take them." "No," she said. "He didn't need to take them. He just needed to know what we have." She moved to the desk. The pages she'd written her figures, her columns, were still there. She picked them up and checked them. They were all there. "He read them," she said. Gideon was very quiet behind her. "He knows we have the full picture." She picked them up and checked them. They were all there. "He read them," she said. Gideon was very quiet behind her. "He knows we have the full picture," she said. "That's what this morning was about. He came to breakfast to see if you'd act on it. You didn't. So now he knows we're waiting for something, probably the marshal." She turned. Gideon was looking at the door. "He's going to run," he said. "Yes," she said. "Before the marshal arrives, tonight or tomorrow morning." "Then we don't wait for the marshal." "Gideon. He'll take whatever he can carry and be across the territorial line before—" "Listen to me." She said it quietly but completely, and he stopped. "If you go at him now without the marshal, without the supplier records, he walks away free. He'll say the ledgers were falsified. He'll say I fabricated the figures. You'll have no legal standing." She held his gaze. "But if you know he's going to run, then you know where he's going to be tonight, and so does Dorsey." Another silence. Then Gideon said slowly, "The South Road. Is there another way off this property that avoids the main gate?" "The South Road past the old line cabin. It's the only route that doesn't pass the bunkhouse." "Then that's where he'll go." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face had moved into something she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, not admiration exactly, but the particular look of a man encountering something he hadn't known he was missing until it was standing right in front of him. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I think like a woman who can't afford to be wrong," she said. He went to find Dorsey. That evening the ranch ran its normal supper time. Mabel put up a full meal for the gathered hands with the particular focused intensity of someone using work to hold themselves still. Nell moved beside her without asking questions, which Mabel appreciated more than she could have articulated. At 8 o'clock, Pike left the main house. He moved quietly. She only knew because Dorsey had positioned a hand near the south barn with instructions to signal when Pike saddled a horse, and the signal came at 8:15. A lamp blinked twice from the barn door. Mabel was in the cookhouse when Gideon came to tell her. "Dorsey's moving," he said. "Go," she said. "I want you to stay inside." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Go." He went. She stood in the cookhouse, and she waited. This was the part of difficult situations she'd never found a strategy for the waiting. After the thinking was done, and the planning was done, and the only remaining task was to hold yourself together while other people acted on what you'd worked out. She was good at most of the other parts. This one she simply endured. Nell sat at the table and said nothing, and was present, which was exactly right. An hour passed. Then she heard voices in the yard, multiple overlapping, and boots on the porch steps, and the door to the main house opening and closing hard. She went to the cookhouse door. Dorsey was crossing the yard with 2 hands flanking him, and Warren Pike walking between them with his wrists held and his riding bag on the ground behind them, where it had been dropped or taken, she couldn't tell which. Pike's face in the lantern light was no longer composed. The amusement was gone. What remained was something much simpler and much less managed, the face of a man who'd miscalculated and was now existing inside that miscalculation and couldn't talk his way out of it. He looked at Mabel standing in the cookhouse doorway. Something moved through his expression. Not contrition, not remorse. Something colder than either of those, the particular look of a man recalibrating who he intends to blame. "This is her doing," he said, loud enough to carry across the yard, directed at Dorsey, at the hands at anyone close enough to hear. "A woman with no credentials and no authority who's been in this house 3 weeks has convinced Mercer that—" "Mr. Pike." Dorsey's voice was quiet and final. "That's enough." They took him inside. Mabel stayed where she was. After a while, Gideon came out of the main house and crossed the yard to where she was standing. He'd been inside with Pike and Dorsey for half an hour. She'd watched the windows, tracking the movement of lamplight from room to room, and he came out looking like a man who'd finished a thing he was glad to have behind him. He stopped in front of her. He had the records, Gideon said. His own copy, a version of the ledger with the figures adjusted. He was going to file a complaint with the territorial office claiming I'd underpaid him over 3 years, and the altered records were his evidence. Mabel absorbed this. That was his second move. Yes. Gideon looked at her steadily. If he'd made it to Cheyenne before we did, he'd have put me on the defensive. My attorney would have been managing his false complaint while he used the confusion to disappear. But he didn't make it to Cheyenne. No, Gideon said. Because you told me he would run tonight. Silence. The ranch was quiet around them. The particular quiet of a late evening after something significant. The sounds of ordinary life continuing while the extraordinary thing settles. The marshal will be here by morning, Gideon said. Dorsey's holding him until then. He paused. He'll answer for all of it. The supplier records, the ledger discrepancies, the wage advances. All of it. Good, she said. He looked at her. The lamplight from the cookhouse door was the only light between them, and in it his face was readable in a way it rarely was. The control he usually maintained was still there, but something underneath it had shifted the way ground shifts after a long rain. You've been here 3 weeks, he said. 22 days. In 22 days, you found what 3 years didn't surface. He said it slowly, like a man working something out rather than making a speech. You protected these records. You anticipated his plan. You talked me out of acting before I had the ground to stand on. He paused. And you made dinner for 40 people during a supply failure. Mabel said nothing. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. That first morning when you put your hand on my door. He met her eyes. Were you frightened? She considered lying. She considered the version of herself that would have said no, straightened her spine, given him the answer that sounded like the woman she'd been trying to appear to be from the moment she rode through his gate. She told him the truth instead. Terrified, she said. Something in him settled, the kind of settling that happens when a man finds out the person he respects was afraid and came anyway, which is a different and more valuable kind of courage than the kind that isn't afraid at all. I want to ask you something too, Mabel said. He waited. The morning you hired me, not Ruth, me, what made you decide? He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, she thought. Choosing his words the way he chose everything, with care and without waste. You asked me to give your mother a fair chance, he said. Not yourself, not the job, her. He looked at her. A woman who's thinking about herself in that moment asks for herself. You asked for her. That told me what I needed to know. The cookhouse lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere. Mabel looked at him, and he looked at her. and the space between them had the quality of a door held slightly open, not pushed, not closed, just resting at that careful angle where everything could still go either way. "Get some rest," she said finally. "The marshal's coming in the morning, and you'll need a clear head." "Yes," he said, but he didn't move immediately. Mabel. It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss in front of it. She felt it register somewhere in her chest, quiet and distinct, the way a bell sounds in an empty room. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the work. For—" He stopped. Started again. "For staying when it would have been easier to go." She thought about the rent notice behind the flower tin, about 11 miles of summer road, about her mother's hand finding hers on the quilt in the lamplight. Staying was never the hard part, she said. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, in the quiet and the warmth of the stove that had been burning all day, with the smell of the evening supper still in the room, and Nell's cup still on the table, and the ledgers gone from the ranch for the first time in 3 years, gone to be dealt with properly, gone to mean what they should have meant all along. She thought about Warren Pike's face in the lantern light. "This is her doing," said like an accusation, said like a woman doing her job and doing it well, was a scandal rather than a fact. She thought about the word "her" in his mouth, the contempt loaded into it, the assumption that her being the one who found it made it less real, less valid, less worth the attention of serious men. She thought about Dorsey saying, "That's enough," quiet and final. Not defending her, she didn't need defending, just cutting off the noise. She thought about Gideon standing in the dark yard saying Mabel and the space between them and the door that was neither open nor closed. She picked up a piece of charcoal. On the back of the last flour sack page, beneath all the columns and figures and corrections, she wrote 2 words to herself in the margin, small and private in her mother's schoolteacher script that she'd inherited along with everything else. Not yet. Not because she was afraid of what was happening between her and Gideon Mercer. Not because she wanted it to stop, but because she had spent 22 days building something real at Red Willow Ranch, something that stood on its own, that had her name in it, as surely as if she'd carved it into the doorframe, and she needed to know that whatever came next was built on the same ground. She needed to know that when the door opened all the way, it was opening because of who she was, not because of what she'd survived. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket. She banked the stove for the night, turned down the lamp, and stood for a moment in the cookhouse. She'd reorganized shelf by shelf and meal by meal, and honest dollar by honest dollar over 3 weeks. It looked like hers, because it was. She went to bed. Tomorrow the marshal was coming, and Warren Pike was going to answer for 3 years of quiet theft, and the cattle gathering was in 2 days, and there was a ranch full of people who needed feeding, and a woman who intended to feed them. But tonight, just for tonight, she let herself feel the full weight of what 22 days of refusing to quit had built. It was considerable. It was hers. And nobody, not Warren Pike, not the distance, not the arithmetic of poverty she'd been doing in her head since she was 13 years old, was ever going to take it from her. The marshal arrived at Red Willow before breakfast. His name was Caldwell, a lean, deliberate man in his 50s, who moved like someone who'd learned long ago that the first person to rush in a serious situation was usually the first person to make a mistake he couldn't take back. He came with the deputy, asked for coffee, sat at Gideon's desk, and spent 2 hours going through every ledger and every page of flour sack figures Mabel had written without saying much of anything. Mabel sat in her chair, the one she'd pulled forward on the first morning, and never stopped pulling forward, and answered his questions when he had them. He had precise questions. "These figures, you compiled them yourself?" "Yes." "How long did it take you?" "1 full day." "You have formal bookkeeping training?" "No," she said. "I have 10 years of making a household run on not enough money. That teaches you to read a ledger." Caldwell looked at her over the papers for a moment. Then he looked back at the papers. "These are accurate," he said, not a question, a determination. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and kept reading. Gideon stood near the window, through most of it, not sitting, not interrupting, present in the way of a man who's placed his trust in a process and intends to honor that by letting it run. He looked at Mabel once during the marshal's questions, when she said 10 years of making a household run on not enough money. And what moved through his expression was brief and quiet, and not for the room. She looked back at the marshal's papers. At 11 o'clock, Caldwell closed the last ledger. "This is sufficient for charges," he said to Gideon. "Fraud and theft under territorial law. The supplier records your man brought from the depot confirm the delivery discrepancies. Combined with Miss Hartley's figures." He paused. "She prepared a cleaner case than most attorneys I've worked with." Gideon said nothing. "I'll need her available to give a deposition in Cheyenne," Caldwell said. "Within the month." "She'll be available," Gideon said. Mabel noted that he didn't ask her first. She also noted that she didn't correct him, which was its own piece of information. She filed away for later. They brought Pike in from where Dorsey had been holding him in the line foreman's cabin. He came in with his jacket straight and his face arranged back into something like its usual composure, and he sat across from the marshal and looked at the ledgers and the flour sack pages, and for one long moment his eyes moved to Mabel. "Those figures were compiled by an untrained woman with a personal interest in discrediting me," he said to Caldwell. "I'd like to know what legal weight they carry." "Significant weight," Caldwell said, "given that they match the supplier's own delivery records line for line." He opened the depot copies and put them side by side with Mabel's pages. "You'd like to explain that, Mr. Pike?" A silence. Pike's composure didn't collapse. She'd give him that. It simply went somewhere else, replaced by a calculation so visible she could nearly follow it moving behind his eyes. He was looking for an exit. Running the options. Finding the doors one by one and discovering that someone had already thought to lock them. He looked at Mabel one more time. "Enjoy it," he said quietly. Just to her. Not loud enough for the marshal, she thought, though Caldwell's expression suggested otherwise. "I intend to," she said. They took him out. The ranch exhaled. She felt it not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way the hands moved through supper that evening, with something lighter in them, the way Dorsey sat at the table and ate 2 full portions without the watchful tension he'd been carrying for 3 days, the way Nell hummed something while she scrubbed pots for the first time since Mabel had arrived. Red Willow had been carrying a weight it didn't fully know it was carrying. Now it wasn't. Gideon came to the cookhouse after supper. He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, in a way she'd come to recognize as the particular stance he took when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "I owe you something," he said. "You pay me every week," she said. "We're even." "That's not what I mean." He came in and set his hat on the table the first time she'd seen him do that, leave his hat anywhere in the cookhouse, and somehow it changed the quality of the air in the room. "When I hired you, when I decided to give you the position instead of waiting for Ruth, I told myself it was a practical decision. The ranch needed running. You could run it, clean and simple." "And now," she said. "Now I know it wasn't that simple," he said. "And I think you knew it wasn't that simple either from very early on. And I think you were careful with that knowledge. Careful with me." He looked at her directly. "I appreciate that." Mabel put down the dish she was drying. "I was careful with myself," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "You're a wealthy man, and I work in your kitchen. Being careful wasn't courtesy. It was survival." He absorbed this without flinching, which was one of the things she'd come to value most about him, the way he received difficult truths without making the person who delivered them responsible for his reaction to them. "What would it take," he said carefully, "to change that equation?" The cookhouse was very quiet. "I don't know yet," she said. "Honestly. I think that's a question for a different conversation." He nodded. He picked up his hat. "Sunday," he said. "What about it? Your mother's well enough to ride. You told me so on Thursday." She had. She'd mentioned it during the morning briefing, the kind of offhand remark you make when you're thinking about someone, and the thought comes out before you've decided to say it. He'd heard it. "You should bring her to Red Willow," he said. "I'd like to meet her." Mabel looked at him. "You want to meet my mother?" "She raised you," he said simply. That seems like something worth understanding. He walked out. She stood in the cookhouse holding a dish towel and looking at the door he'd just gone through, and she understood clearly, completely, with the same certainty she'd felt looking at the ledger figures that first morning, that things were changing. Not slowly, not ambiguously. Changing the way a river changes its course after a long rain. You don't see it happen. You look up and the water's going a different direction. She folded the dish towel. She went to write her mother a letter. Ruth Hartley arrived at Red Willow Ranch on a Sunday morning in late August, riding the bay mare Gideon had sent to Dry Creek the previous evening with one of his hands, because the mare was younger and smoother than Bess, and the road was long, and Ruth had been ill, and Gideon Mercer apparently thought of things like that without being asked. Ruth noticed the mare. She noticed the hand who rode with her, polite and unobtrusive and clearly under instructions to make the journey comfortable. She noticed all of it and said nothing about it because Ruth Hartley had raised a daughter alone for 10 years and had learned early that the most important things were usually the things nobody was making a speech about. She arrived looking better than Mabel had seen her in months. The fever had taken weight off her, but the recovery had put color back in her face, and she came through the Red Willow gate, sitting straight in the saddle, with the particular dignified bearing of a woman who'd been a schoolteacher and intended the world to remember it. Mabel was waiting at the gate. They looked at each other for a moment, the way they sometimes did, the two of them, after any significant length of time apart, taking inventory, making sure the other one was still intact. "You look tired," Ruth said. "You look better," Mabel said. Ruth dismounted, smoothed her dress, and looked around the ranch with the systematic attention she gave to everything. Then she looked at her daughter. "Show me the kitchen," she said. Mabel showed her. Ruth walked through the cookhouse without speaking, opening jars, checking seals, pressing her finger into the flour to test its moisture, looking at the ledger columns Mabel had started keeping on proper paper now that Gideon had provided it. She looked at the reorganized shelving, the restocked pantry, the labeled crocks, and the correctly stored onions and potatoes, and the smokehouse inventory pinned to the wall in Mabel's careful hand. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse, and she was very quiet for a long moment. "This is better than anything I would have done," she said. "You taught me," Mabel said. "I taught you what I knew," Ruth said. "You went further than that." She turned. "This is your kitchen, Mabel, not mine." The words landed somewhere Mabel hadn't known was still tender. "The job was yours," she said. "The job was an opportunity," Ruth said. "You made it into something else." She reached out and took her daughter's hand, held it briefly firmly the way she'd held it beside that bed in the lamplight. "I'm not taking it back from you." Mabel didn't answer. She didn't need to. Gideon met them on the front porch of the main house at noon. He'd known the time of Ruth's arrival. Mabel had told him during the morning briefing, and he was there when they came around the corner of the cookhouse, which told her he'd been watching for them and had come out early enough to be easy about it, so it looked like chance rather than anticipation. She noticed things like that about him now. "Mrs. Hartley," he said. He offered his hand. Ruth took it and looked at him directly in the way she had of looking at people that made most of them feel very seen very quickly. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "my daughter tells me you run a good ranch." "Your daughter has improved it considerably," he said. Ruth looked at Mabel, then back at Gideon. "Yes," she said. "She tends to do that, too." They ate lunch at the long table in the main house, the three of them with Dorsey and his wife joining at Gideon's invitation, and the conversation ran across the ranch and the territory, and Ruth's years of teaching, and Gideon's early days, building Red Willow from 200 head and a leaking bunkhouse. Ruth listened to him the way she'd listened to her best students, not waiting for him to finish so she could respond, but actually listening, following the thread, asking the questions that lived at the center of what he'd said, rather than the edges. Gideon, Mabel noticed, talked more than she'd ever heard him talk. Afterward, when Gideon had gone to check the afternoon cattle work, Ruth and Mabel sat together on the front porch in the last of the summer warmth. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He's in love with you." Mabel looked at the yard. "Mom, I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I saw at that table." Ruth's voice was steady and calm. The way a man looks at someone when he thinks they're not watching is the truest thing about him. He looked at you that way 3 times during lunch. He's a wealthy man, Mabel said. He runs this entire ranch. He's a person, Ruth said, who's been alone longer than is good for him and has found someone he doesn't want to be alone near. She paused. And you feel the same way. Don't tell me you don't. Mabel said nothing. I know you, sweetheart, Ruth said quietly. You've been careful your whole life. Careful with money, careful with hope, careful with anything that could be taken away. She turned to look at her daughter. You don't have to be careful with this. I don't know how to not be careful, Mabel said. I know, Ruth said. That's what I'm worried about. They sat together in the afternoon light and didn't say anything else about it, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind built over years of sharing the same small house and the same hard winters and the same careful arithmetic. Then Ruth said, I heard about Warren Pike. Word travels. Dry Creek is a small town. By Wednesday. She paused. He said in the yard that night Dorsey's wife told me that it was your doing, that you'd manipulated the situation. Yes. And the ranch hands, what did they say? Mabel thought about Dorsey's quiet, that's enough. About the catfish the older hens had brought from the river during the supply failure. About the way the cookhouse had felt the morning after Pike was taken lighter, more air in it. Everyone moving with less weight on them. They said nothing, she said. They just kept working. Ruth nodded. That's the best kind of answer. Gideon found Mabel alone behind the cookhouse late that afternoon, the quiet hour between the last of the lunch clearing and the start of dinner prep, when the ranch was at its most still. She was sitting on the bench she'd started thinking of as her bench, the one outside the cookhouse door, where she came to think when the work allowed it. He sat beside her. Not close enough to be anything other than 2 people sitting on a bench, but present. Deliberately, consciously present. Your mother, he said. She's something, isn't she? Mabel said. She looked at me at lunch, he said, like she was reading the back of a book to decide if it was worth her time. Mabel smiled before she could stop it. That's exactly what she was doing. Did I pass? She's still here, Mabel said. That's your answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she told me something, before she came to find you. Mabel turned to look at him. What? She told me about the bakery, he said. Mabel went still. She said you've wanted it since you were 15 years old, Gideon continued. A kitchen and a dining room where working people could always find a hot meal at a price they could afford. She said every dollar you saved went to the household before it could go to that. She said... He paused. She said you gave up more for her than she ever asked you to, and you never once made her feel the weight of it. Mabel looked away. She shouldn't have told you that, she said. Her voice was controlled, mostly. She thought I should know. It's not relevant to... Mabel. His voice was quiet and direct. I want to help you build it. She turned back to him. No. I have the capital. No. She said it plainly, without heat, but absolutely. I won't be a poor woman who gets her dream funded by a rich man. I won't spend the rest of my life owing something I can never pay back in kind. He looked at her for a moment. I didn't say I'd give it to you. She waited. Red Willow produces beef grain milk preserved goods, he said. You understand food management, supply chains, bulk purchasing, and large-scale cooking better than any person I've employed. If there were a kitchen and supply business operating out of this ranch, one that sold provision services to other ranches in the county, stage stations, mining camps, it would be profitable, genuinely profitable, not charity, business. Mabel looked at him. A partnership, he said. Equal terms. Your name on the contract beside mine. Your decisions carry the same weight as mine in any matter concerning the provision operation. The capital comes from Red Willow. The expertise comes from you. The profits split according to contribution documented and signed. She was quiet. I've already spoken to my attorney, he said. She turned sharply. You spoke to your attorney before you spoke to me. I spoke to my attorney about whether the legal structure I was considering was sound, he said evenly. I'm speaking to you about whether you want it. Those are two different conversations. She stared at him. Is the structure sound? She said finally. Very. What would it be called? He reached into his jacket and produced a single folded page, his attorney's letterhead, she saw with a draft heading at the top. She looked at it. Mercer and Hartley Provision Company. Her name. Beside his. On a legal document. On paper that meant something. Her hands, she realized, were not entirely steady. Your mother suggested the name, he said. Of course she did, Mabel said. She looked at the page for a long time. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would. My decisions on purchasing, staffing, and operational management are final within the provision operation. You don't override them. Agreed. If the business fails, we dissolve as equal partners. You don't absorb my losses, and I don't absorb yours. Agreed. I hire who I hire based on capability, not on who's connected to this ranch. Agreed. He paused. Any others? She looked at him. At the document. At her name on that page. I want to employ women, she said. Widows' women on their own, women other employers overlook. I want fair wages for them documented in the contract. Something moved through his expression, something that had nothing to do with business. Write in whatever you need, he said quietly. I'll sign it. She folded the page carefully and held it. I need to think, she said. Take the time you need. He stood. He was almost back to the cookhouse corner when she spoke. Gideon. He turned. Why? She said. The real reason. Not the business case. You could find a business manager anywhere in this territory. Why me? He stood for a moment in the late afternoon, and she watched him decide to tell her the truth, the way she'd watched him make other decisions deliberately, without performance. Choosing the honest answer because it was the right one, rather than because it was the easy one. Because I've spent 15 years building something, he said, and most of that time I told myself the building was enough, that the ranch was enough, that a man who owned his land and his cattle and his future had no reason to want for anything else. He paused. You rode through my gate 22 days ago, asking me to give your mother a chance, and you looked at my pantry for 2 minutes and knew everything that was wrong with it, and you sat at my kitchen table and cooked dinner for 26 people, like it was the most natural thing in the world to do in someone else's house. He stopped. And Red Willow started feeling different, like there was something in it that hadn't been there before. He met her eyes. I don't want to go back to before. Mabel looked at him standing there in the late August afternoon, saying the truest thing she'd heard anyone say to her in a long time. I'll have an answer for you by morning, she said. He nodded. He walked away. She sat on her bench and held the folded document and did not try to think too hard or too fast, which was difficult because she'd spent her whole life having to think fast and hard and ahead, always calculating the next 2 moves, because there was no margin for getting the first one wrong. But this wasn't that kind of calculation. Ruth found her there 20 minutes later and sat beside her without asking and didn't say anything for a while. Then, he asked you. He did. And? I told him I'd answer in the morning. Ruth was quiet. Then, what's stopping you from answering now? Mabel thought about it honestly. I've been careful so long, she said. I don't entirely trust myself when I stop. Ruth put her hand over her daughter's, the hand holding the folded document. Sweetheart, she said, you've been careful because you had to be, because every mistake cost us something real, and there was no one else to carry it. She paused. But look at what you've built in 22 days. Look at this ranch. Look at that kitchen. Look at that man's face when he talks to you. Her grip tightened slightly. You're not making a decision from fear anymore. You're making a decision from solid ground. Those are different things. Mabel looked at the document. He put my name first, she said. Ruth looked at the heading she could see through the fold of the page, Mercer and Hartley. So he did, she said. They sat together until the supper bell was almost due, and then Mabel smoothed her dress and went back into the cookhouse. She put up supper for 30 people. She did it with the same focused completeness she brought to every meal. Nothing wasted, everything intentional. The food made with the same care she'd brought to every meal since she was 13 years old. But something was different tonight. Tonight, when Dorsey came through the door and said, "Smells right, Miss Hartley," and the hands came in and filled the table with the particular loud, tired working energy of men who'd put in a full day tonight, she looked at it and she thought, I built this. Not just the meal, the kitchen, the ledgers, the system that would keep this ranch fed through winter and the next winter and the one after that. She'd built it from nothing except what her mother had taught her, and what poverty had made her learn, and what her own stubborn refusal to be turned away at a porch had made possible. She could build a business the same way. She could put her name on a document and mean it. After supper, when the cookhouse was clean and Nell had gone home and the ranch was settling into its evening quiet, Mabel went to Gideon's office. She knocked. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. He was at his desk. He looked up. She crossed the room, picked up his pen and held out her hand for the document. He took it from his jacket, put it on the desk. Open. She read every line, all of them, slowly and completely, the way she read everything that mattered. Then she signed her name beside his. Mabel R. Hartley, clean and certain in her mother's schoolteacher script. She set the pen down. She looked at him, and Gideon Mercer looked at her signature beside his name on that page, and something in his face did what it very rarely did. It opened fully without the control he usually kept across it. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Work with me." He stood. How was close enough now that the lamp between them was the only distance left, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the door that had been resting at that careful angle for 22 days, moved not forced, not rushed, just shifted gently, all the way open. "I've been wanting to ask you something," he said. "Since about the third morning you were here." "Then ask it," she said. "Stay at Red Willow," he said. "Not as my employee, not as my business partner." His voice was even and direct and completely serious. "Stay, because I want you here. Because this ranch is better with you in it. Because he paused. "Because I am not the same man I was the morning you put your hand on my door, and I don't want to be." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl who'd ridden 11 miles on a 15-year-old horse with a dead man's letter, and nothing but stubbornness holding her upright. She thought about what that girl would have said if someone had told her where that ride was going to end. She thought about her name on that document, Mercer and Hartley, hers first. "I came here asking you to give my mother a chance," she said. He took her hand. His was warm and steady and certain. "And somehow," he said quietly, "you gave me one." She looked at their hands. She looked at his face. She looked at the document on the desk with both their names on it, and the lamp burning between them, and the whole of Red Willow Ranch quiet outside the window. "Yes," she said. Just that. One word. But she meant every version of it. Yes to the partnership. Yes to the staying. Yes to the man standing in front of her, who'd looked at a woman everyone else had already dismissed and said, "Come inside and have you eaten, and what's wrong with my pantry," and meant every word of all of it. Yes, she meant all of it. The contract was filed in Cheyenne on a Tuesday, and by Thursday the entire county knew about it. Dry Creek. Being the kind of town where news traveled faster than the stage, and twice as far, the particulars arrived at every breakfast table, every merchant counter, and every ranch gate in the surrounding territory within 48 hours of the ink drying. The widow's daughter. The millionaire cattleman. A provision company with both their names on the deed. People had opinions about it, and they expressed those opinions with the particular enthusiasm of communities that have been given something interesting to talk about. Most of the opinions ran in one direction. A woman with no formal training, and no family connections, and no capital of her own, had no business putting her name beside Gideon Mercer's on a legal document. She'd gotten above herself. She'd taken advantage of a situation. There would be trouble. Mabel heard the talk the same way she heard most things through Nell, who was 17 and constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, and through the hands who brought news in from town with their supply runs, and through the particular quality of silence that settled over a room when she walked into it in the first weeks after the contract was filed. She let it run. She'd learned early that talk ran itself out faster when you didn't fight it, and fighting it required energy she had better uses for. She had a business to build. The Mercer and Hartley Provision Company opened its first formal accounts in September, 6 weeks after Mabel had signed her name on that page. The structure was exactly what Gideon had described. Red Willow's production capacity, Mabel's operational knowledge, and a service offering that went out to every ranch mining camp and stage station within a 2-day ride. The first 3 inquiries came back within a week. The Colbert Ranch, whose owner had eaten Mabel's braised beef at that first dinner and told Gideon he ought to keep her. A mining operation 40 miles east that was spending twice what it should have been on provisioning because nobody on site understood bulk purchasing. And a stage line with 6 stations that had been rotating through 3 different unreliable suppliers for 2 years and wanted a single source it could count on. Mabel sat with those 3 letters at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening and ran the numbers on flour sack paper because she still hadn't entirely switched to proper ledger paper and didn't intend to until the numbers justified the expense of the upgrade. Gideon sat across from her. "The mining operation is the biggest immediate revenue," she said. "But the stage line is the most stable long-term account. 6 stations, consistent volume, predictable schedule. That's the one I want to build around." "The stage line manager is known to be difficult," Gideon said. "He's pushed out 2 suppliers in the last 3 years. Why? Inconsistency. Late deliveries substituted goods short waits." "Then he's not difficult," Mabel said. "He's someone who knows what he's paying for and expects to receive it. That's not difficult. That's reasonable." She looked at the letter. "I'll go meet him myself." Gideon looked at her. "He's in Laramie." "I know where he is." "That's a full day's ride." "I've ridden 11 miles in summer heat on a 15-year-old horse to knock on a stranger's door," she said. "I think I can manage Laramie." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll come with you." She looked up. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to." A pause. "And the stage line manager will take the meeting more seriously if a man is in the room," she said flatly. "If the principal of the operation is present," he said. "Which you are, and so am I." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "We leave at dawn Wednesday." They rode to Laramie on Wednesday, and the stage line manager, a compact gray-haired man named Irwin Bliss, who had the manner of someone who'd been disappointed by suppliers so many times he'd stopped bothering to hide his skepticism, met them in his office with the particular courtesy that was not warmth, just the professional performance of patience while he waited for them to say something worth his time. Mabel put her numbers on his desk before she said a word. 6 months of projected provision volume. Pricing by category. Delivery schedule with built-in contingency dates. Quality guarantee terms that she'd written herself specific and enforceable, nothing vague. And at the bottom, a list of references. Colbert Hatch Dorsey's external contacts the depot manager who'd supplied Red Willow's records for the Pike investigation, and had told Gideon afterward that the Hartley woman's figures were the cleanest accounting he'd seen come out of a private ranch operation. Bliss read it. He read it all the way through. Then he went back and read 2 sections again. Then he looked at Mabel. "You wrote this?" "Yes." "Not an attorney?" "No." "Not a bookkeeper?" "I'm my own bookkeeper," she said. "Have been for 10 years. He looked at the quality guarantee terms specifically. "These are enforceable. If you miss a delivery window or substitute a product without prior approval, you're liable for the replacement cost plus my operational loss." "Yes," she said. "That's what it says." "Most suppliers won't sign terms like that." "Most suppliers can't afford to keep them," Mabel said. "I can." Bliss set the papers down. He looked at Gideon. "You let her write the contract terms." "She is the operation," Gideon said. "I provide the capital and the ranch resources. What she puts on a contract is her decision." Bliss looked back at Mabel. 6 stations, he said. Year-round supply. No exceptions for weather or other clients. "Weather contingencies are built into the delivery schedule," Mabel said. "Read the 4th paragraph. You have a 48-hour window either side of the contracted date. That covers most weather events short of a true emergency. And a true emergency. Then we talk like adults and find a solution, she said. I don't write contracts that only work when nothing goes wrong. I write contracts for real conditions. Bliss was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and signed. Gideon said nothing until they were outside and mounted and moving back through Laramie toward the road east. Then he said, "You told him you write contracts for real conditions." "Yes." "Where did you learn contract language?" "My mother had 2 law books in her library," Mabel said. "I read them when I was 17. I didn't have anything else to read." He looked at her sideways, and then he did something she hadn't heard from him many times. He laughed. Not a polite sound. A real one from somewhere unguarded. She looked at him. He looked at her. They rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who don't need to fill silence to feel at ease in it. The first Mercer and Hartley delivery ran in October and went without a problem. The second did too. By November, word had moved through the territory's supply networks, the way good word moved, not loudly but persistently from person to person who'd found something that actually did what it claimed. 3 more accounts came in before Christmas. Mabel hired her first employee in October, a widow named Clara Voss, who'd been taking in washing and selling eggs since her husband died of a ranch accident the previous spring, and had 3 children under 10. And the kind of practical kitchen knowledge that came from feeding a family on a farmhand's wage for 15 years. Clara showed up on a Monday morning with her hair pinned and her apron clean, and the composed determination of a woman who'd decided to stop waiting for the world to improve and start making it. Mabel hired her on the spot and paid her $1 more per week than the going rate for household work in the county. Gideon saw Clara's wage in the operational ledger that evening. He didn't say a word about it. What he did say was, "Do you need a second hire?" "Next month," Mabel said, "when the stage line volume increases in the winter season." "Anyone in mind?" "Dorsey's wife," she said. "She sent me 6 jars of preserved corn during the supply failure and didn't ask for anything back. That tells me what I need to know about her." Gideon nodded. "Ask her." She did. Dorsey's wife. Her name was Harriet, and she was a solid, capable woman in her 40s who'd been running a ranch household for 20 years and could put up preserves faster than anyone Mabel had seen. Said yes before Mabel had finished the offer and showed up Wednesday morning and didn't need to be told anything twice. By December, the Mercer and Hartley Provision Company employed 4 women. By January, it was 6. Every one of them was someone other employers had looked past too old, too plain, too burdened, too recently widowed, too inconvenient. Every one of them was extraordinary at the work. The talk in Dry Creek shifted. Not quickly. Not all at once. The way talk shifted when reality kept contradicting it long enough that holding on to the original story started requiring more effort than the story was worth. People who'd said the widow's daughter had gotten above herself began quietly revising their assessment when the widow's daughter's contracts were being signed by the largest stage line in the territory, and her operation was running cleaner and more profitably than any comparable business in the county. It was Harriet who told Mabel about the shift on a January morning when the first serious snow of the winter had come down overnight, and the cookhouse was warm, and the 2 of them were putting up the week's preserves. "Mrs. Colbert was at the dry goods store on Saturday," Harriet said. "She told Mrs. Patterson that Mabel Hartley runs the most professional provision operation she's seen in 20 years of ranch life." Mabel kept working. "Mrs. Colbert has never spoken to me directly." "No," Harriet said. "But she's speaking about you, which in this county is more useful." Then came the day in February that Mabel had not anticipated and should have. She was in the office. Her office now. The room Pike had occupied for 3 years had been quietly reassigned to the Provision Company's administration after his departure, and Mabel had taken it without fanfare and organized it with the same systematic attention she'd brought to the cookhouse when the door opened and a man she didn't recognize walked in without knocking. How was well dressed. Town dressed, not ranch dressed. 40 or so, with the careful grooming of a man who wanted to be taken seriously and the slight edge of someone who wasn't used to having to work at it. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Mrs." She stopped herself. "Not yet. Miss Hartley, she said. You are James Cordell. He sat across from her without being invited, which she noted. I represent a group of investors from Cheyenne who have an interest in provision operations serving the territory's expanding infrastructure. We've heard of your company. What kind of interest? She said. Acquisition, he said. We'd like to buy you out. The operation, the contracts, the staffing framework. We're prepared to offer a very fair price. Mabel looked at him. Who told you about us? Word travels, he said. You've built something notable in a short period. That attracts attention. And what would happen to my employees if you acquired the operation? He smiled the smile of a man accustomed to questions about employees being a preliminary to the real conversation about money. The operational staff would be evaluated on their contributions and retained as appropriate. Evaluated by whom? Our operational management team. Who are currently? He blinked. I'm not sure what. Who are currently employed by your group, she said. Who would be doing the evaluating? What are their qualifications for assessing provision operations? What's their record with the employees of businesses they've previously acquired? The smile had gone somewhere less comfortable. I don't have those specifics to hand, he said. Then I'd suggest you get them before we have this conversation, Mabel said. Because the staffing structure of this company is not incidental to its value. It's the source of its value. 6 women who other employers didn't want are the reason your Cheyenne investors heard about us in the first place. If your acquisition plan treats them as a secondary consideration, your acquisition plan is missing what it's actually buying. Cordell looked at her for a moment. You're not interested in selling, he said. I haven't heard a proposal I'd consider, she said. Which is different from not being interested. If your investors want a serious conversation about a partnership structure that preserves operational control and protects the staff, I'll have that conversation. If they want to buy something they can run differently, they should find a different operation. He left without closing the deal. He also left, she would learn 2 weeks later, and went directly to Gideon's foreman with an offer to buy Red Willow's cattle contracts separately. An end run she hadn't anticipated, and that Gideon shut down inside an hour with a directness that Dorsey described to Harriet, and Harriet described to Mabel over the preserves. He told Cordell that Red Willow's contracts were not separable from the provision companies, Harriet said, and that any approach to his operational staff that bypassed Miss Hartley was an approach he considered an approach to him, and that he didn't want to hear from Cordell's investors again. Mabel absorbed this. He didn't tell me he did that, she said. No, Harriet said. I reckon he didn't think it needed saying. She thought about that for a long time. That evening she went to Gideon's office. She still thought of it as his office, though the line between his space and hers in this ranch house had been shifting gradually and naturally for months. The way property lines shift when 2 people stop thinking of the boundary as a boundary. She opened the door. He looked up. Cordell came to see you, she said. Dorsey told you. Harriet told me. Dorsey told Harriet. She sat. You didn't mention it. You were handling it, he said. You didn't need me to handle it for you. And the cattle contracts. Those are mine to protect, he said. Cordell tried to separate what isn't separable. I corrected that impression. She looked at him. We should have a formal agreement, she said. In writing. That the provision company and Red Willow supply contracts are structurally connected. If someone wants to acquire one, they're acquiring both, and both require mutual consent. He picked up a pen. Write the language, I'll sign it. She wrote it that night. He signed it the next morning. She filed it in Cheyenne the following week alongside the original contract. Both names. Equal terms. Clear and permanent. The winter ran long and hard that year, as Wyoming winters did, the kind that tested operations and men and marriages and anything else that wasn't built on solid ground. Red Willow held. The provision company held. Every delivery went out on schedule. Every account received exactly what it had been promised. And by the time March came and the snow began to pull back from the southern pastures, the Mercer and Hartley Provision Company had more accounts than it had been operating in December, and a waiting list for 2 more. And Ruth Hartley was living in a small cottage near the main house that Gideon had built over the winter, not given to her. He'd been careful about that. He'd offered it to her at a nominal rent that was documented in writing, and that Ruth had reviewed and accepted with the particular dignity of a woman who understood the difference between a gift and a fair arrangement, and appreciated being offered the latter. Ruth had flourished at Red Willow the way she'd flourished everywhere she'd brought her mind and her patience to bear quietly, thoroughly, and with the cumulative effect of someone who made every room she occupied slightly better organized and better understood. She took over the record-keeping for the Provision Company's Cheyenne filings. Her school teacher's handwriting was cleaner than anyone else's, and she had the kind of systematic precision with legal documents that came from years of administering a schoolhouse on a frontier budget where every piece of paper counted. She and Gideon had a standing chess game on Sunday evenings that Mabel refused to referee. "You're letting her win," Mabel said to Gideon one Sunday, watching her mother move a bishop across the board with a small, satisfied expression. "I'm not," he said. "He isn't," Ruth said without looking up. "I'm simply better at this than he is." She looked up. "Sit down, Mabel. Stop hovering." Mabel sat. It was April when Gideon asked her. Not formally. Not with ceremony. He was not she'd discovered over 8 months of knowing him well enough to know a man who expressed important things through ceremony. He expressed them through directness, through action, through the accumulated weight of small consistent choices made daily in the same direction. They were on the bench behind the cookhouse. Her bench, though he'd started occupying the other half of it so regularly that it had stopped feeling exclusively hers and started feeling like theirs. Which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had put into words yet. It was early April, the evening cool, the ranch quiet. He said, "I want to marry you." She looked at him. "Not because of the company," he said. "Not because of what you've built here. Because I want to marry you." Mabel Hartley. The woman who put her hand on my door and told me she hadn't ridden 11 miles to be turned away at the porch. His voice was level and certain. "Because I have not wanted a single day to end for 8 months without knowing you'd be here when it started again." She looked at the yard in front of them. The ranch she'd reorganized shelf by shelf and dollar by dollar and relationship by relationship. The kitchen she'd built from someone else's chaos into something that ran like a well-made clock. The women she'd hired and the accounts she'd signed and the contracts she'd written on flour sack paper before she had proper ledger pages. "You spoke to my mother," she said. "Yesterday," he said. "She told me the decision was yours and that I should say exactly what I meant without dressing it up." That sounds like her. It was very useful advice. Mabel was quiet for a moment. "I came here to save my mother's job," she said. "I know. I came here with a patched dress and a dead man's letter and a horse too old for the road." "I know," he said. "And I'm not the same woman who rode through your gate," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not marrying you from that place. I'm not marrying you because I'm grateful, or because you offered me a contract when I needed one." She turned and looked at him directly. "I'm marrying you because you looked at a woman everybody else had already dismissed, and you said come inside, and you meant it. Because you've never once tried to make me smaller, to make yourself more comfortable. Because you signed a contract with my name beside yours and didn't think it needed any particular bravery." He held her gaze. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she said. He took her hand. They sat together on the bench in the April evening, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying, and they'd both learned by now the value of not filling good silence with unnecessary noise. They married in June under the cottonwoods beside the main house on a morning that was warm without being brutal and clear without being harsh. The kind of Wyoming June day that made you understand why people stayed in the territory, even when everything else about it was difficult. The ceremony was simple. Mabel had insisted on simple. She had no interest in spectacle, and Gideon had even less, and so it was the preacher from Dry Creek and the people of Red Willow Ranch and Ruth Hartley, standing up straight in her best dress with her schoolteacher composure intact and her eyes not quite dry. Dorsey and Harriet stood together near the cottonwoods. Clara Voss had brought her 3 children, scrubbed and combed and fidgeting in the particular way of children who've been told to behave and are trying very hard. The hands stood with their hats in their hands, and the quiet respect of people who'd watched something unfold over 8 months and knew they'd been present for something worth attending to. Mabel wore a dress she'd made herself. Not her old brown-patched dress. A new one. Ivory cotton with small covered buttons, simple and well-fitted, and made with the same careful attention she brought to everything she put her hands to. She'd folded the old brown dress the night before and put it in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Not because she wanted to forget it, because it deserved to be kept. When the preacher asked her if she took this man, she said yes, the same way she'd said yes in his office on the evening she signed the contract, clearly, completely, without hedging. One word that meant every version of itself. Gideon held her hand through the whole of it. Not protectively, not possessively. The way two people hold hands when they've decided they're in the same enterprise and intend to stay there. Afterward, the ranch fed everyone. Mabel had organized the wedding meal herself, which was either contradictory or entirely consistent, depending on how well you knew her, and everyone who knew her understood it was the latter. Harriet and Clara had run the cookhouse from 5 in the morning. The provision company's resources had been marshaled with the same precise efficiency they brought to every delivery. It was the best meal Red Willow Ranch had ever produced. Dorsey said so publicly at the table, which made Harriet tell him he was only saying it because he was hungry, which made the whole table laugh, which was exactly the right note for the occasion. Ruth ate with them and laughed with them, and when the meal was done, and people were beginning to drift back to their work and their lives, she found Mabel near the cottonwoods and stood beside her for a moment. "Well," Ruth said. "Well," Mabel said. "That dress turned out beautifully. You helped me with the buttonholes." "You let me help you," Ruth said. "That's different." She put her hand briefly on her daughter's arm. "Your father would have—" She stopped, started again. "He would have been so proud of who you became. Not just today. Every day of the last 8 months." Mabel covered her mother's hand with her own. She didn't try to answer that. Some things didn't need answering. That fall. The first full season of the Provision Company's maturity. Mercer and Hartley provisioned 14 accounts across the territory. The stage line signed a 3-year extension. 2 mining operations came on as annual clients. A new settlement forming 40 miles north sent a letter asking if they extended service to developing communities. Mabel wrote back and said yes, and offered a settlement rate that accounted for the cost of development. She employed 11 women by October. 8 of them had come to her the same way Clara Voss had, with nothing to offer except everything they knew and everything they were willing to do, which had turned out to be more than enough. She paid them all fairly and documented every wage in the ledger and reviewed those figures herself every month, and never once let the documentation slip, because she understood that the day you stopped watching the numbers was the day someone else started watching them for their own purposes. Gideon ran Red Willow. She ran the Provision Company. They ran the mornings together with coffee and ledgers, the way they'd started running mornings before either of them had put a name to what was happening between them. The town of Dry Creek eventually stopped having opinions about whether Mabel Hartley had gotten above herself. Not because public opinion reformed itself with any great virtue, but because the evidence had accumulated past the point where the original story made sense, and most people prefer a story that makes sense. The story that made sense was this: a woman had ridden into a wealthy man's ranch and built something. She'd built a kitchen, a business, a life. She'd done it with her hands and her mind, and the accumulated knowledge of 10 years of refusing to let hardship be the last word on who she was going to become. That story people found they could hold on to without embarrassment. Some of the women Mabel employed had their own versions of it, their own 11-mile roads, their own patched dresses, their own doors they'd had to put their hands on to keep from closing. They brought those stories to work with them every day. Mabel saw them in the way Clara Voss moved through the cookhouse, purposeful and steady, the way Harriet checked inventory with the precision of someone who'd learned long ago that a missed count cost more than the effort of counting correctly. She saw herself in all of them. That was the part she hadn't anticipated how much it would mean to watch someone else walk through a door she'd helped keep open. One evening in November, nearly a year and a half after the morning she'd first ridden through Red Willow's gate, Mabel sat at the long kitchen table with the month's ledgers in front of her, and the lamp burning warm, and the house settled into its evening quiet around her. Gideon came in, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set one in front of her, and sat across from her with his own. He looked at the ledgers. "Good month." "Very good month," she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. She looked at him across the table. At this man who'd opened his door and meant it. Who'd signed his name beside hers without flinching. Who'd run Dorsey to the South Road in the dark, and told Cordell's investors that what belonged together stayed together. "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "I came here asking for my mother's job," she said. He set down his cup. His eyes were steady on hers, the way they'd been steady that first morning when he'd looked at her across his desk and asked a woman he'd never met to tell him how sick her mother was. "I know," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that every morning I come through that cookhouse door, every single morning, I know exactly what it cost to get here. And I know exactly what it's worth." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. "So do I," he said. Outside, Red Willow Ranch breathed in the November dark. The cattle in the pastures, the women in their homes, the accounts stacked on her desk, the cedar chest with the brown dress folded carefully inside it. It was a life built from nothing except refusal. Refusal to be turned away. Refusal to accept less than what she'd earned. Refusal to let the arithmetic of poverty be the final word on what she was capable of becoming. Mabel Hartley had ridden 11 miles on a 15-year-old horse with a dead man's letter and a mother burning with fever, and not one single guarantee that any